When my stepson's hands grazed my back as he zipped up my dress, I felt a spark that shattered the boundaries we swore to uphold. How could an innocent act spiral into something so dangerously intimate? In the quiet moments that followed, I found myself questioning everything. My marriage, my desires, and the fragile lines that define family. But secrets have a way of unraveling, and as the tension between us reached its breaking point, I was forced to confront the one question I had been avoiding. How far would I go to protect the life I thought I wanted? Who? When my stepson's hands grazed my skin as he zipped up my dress, I felt a spark I hadn't felt in years. It was supposed to be a simple moment, an innocent act of assistance. But in that brief second, the atmosphere shifted and everything changed. I could feel the weight of unspoken tension hanging in the air, thick and undeniable. How did it come to this? The day began like any other. My husband, Mark, was away on another business trip, leaving me alone to prepare for the annual charity gala. This wasn't unusual. His job often demanded his absence, even on days that should have been special. Our 10th wedding anniversary, the day we'd promised to celebrate our love, was just another casualty of his packed schedule. I stared at myself in the mirror that afternoon, running my fingers along the soft fabric of the navy blue gown I had chosen. It fit well enough, but the zipper at the back had proven impossible to manage alone. With a sigh, I stepped out of my room and called down the hall, "Adam, can you give me a hand for a second?" Adam, my 22-year-old stepson, had been staying with us for the summer, taking a break from his busy college life. He appeared at the door moments later, his usual confident smile replaced with a curious expression. "What's up?" he asked. "I can't zip this thing up by myself," I admitted, turning to expose the open zipper. "Would you mind?" His footsteps approached, and I could hear the rustle of fabric as he reached for the zipper. His fingers brushed against the bare skin of my back, and an unexpected shiver ran through me. "Sorry," he murmured, his voice low and apologetic. "It's fine," I replied quickly, though my voice betrayed a slight tremor. I told myself it was nothing. He was just helping me. Nothing more. But as his hands moved, slow and deliberate, pulling the zipper upward, I couldn't help noticing the heat radiating from his touch. "There," he said, stepping back. I turned to thank him, and for a split second our eyes met. His gaze lingered just a little too long, and I felt a strange flutter in my chest. I quickly looked away, brushing invisible lint from the dress. "Thanks, Adam. I appreciate it." "Sure," he replied casually, though there was a hint of something in his tone, something I couldn't quite place. He smiled, wide enough for her to see her baby in his thin eyes. As he left the room, I sank onto the edge of my bed, my thoughts swirling. It was ridiculous to feel this way. He was my stepson, for heaven's sake, and I was a married woman. Yet the sensation of his hands and the intensity of his gaze lingered, leaving me more flustered than I cared to admit. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I busied myself with preparations for the gala, trying to push the morning's incident from my mind. By the time evening came, I had convinced myself it was all in my head, a fleeting moment of awkwardness that meant nothing. But as I descended the stairs, ready to leave for the event, I caught Adam watching me from the living room. His eyes traveled up and down, taking in my appearance with a look I couldn't decipher. "You look amazing," he said, his voice sincere and warm. "Thank you," I replied, forcing a smile. His compliment, though innocent, sent a flicker of warmth through me. I chided myself silently for reading into things. He was just being kind. After the gala, I returned home to an empty house. Mark had texted earlier to say he wouldn't make it back until late, leaving me to end the evening alone. I poured myself a glass of wine and sank into the couch, the events of the day playing on a loop in my mind. I was startled when Adam entered the room, his casual demeanor masking whatever thoughts he might have had. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, sitting down beside me. "Something like that," I replied, swirling the wine in my glass. We fell into easy conversation, the kind we'd shared often over the summer. He talked about his plans for the future, his friends at college, and the challenges of balancing it all. For a moment, it felt normal, comfortable. But then, as the conversation slowed, he looked at me with an intensity that made my breath hitch. "You know, you're too hard on yourself," he said, his voice softer now. "You deserve someone who makes you feel special all the time." The words caught me off guard. I laughed nervously, trying to deflect. "That's sweet of you to say." "I mean it," he insisted, his gaze unwavering. "You're incredible, and anyone who doesn't see that is blind." His words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. I felt my cheeks flush, and for a moment I couldn't meet his eyes. "Adam, thank you," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine in a gesture that felt both innocent and loaded with meaning. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me, leaving me more confused than ever. I quickly pulled my hand away, standing abruptly. "I should get some rest," I said, trying to steady my voice. "No substitute for sleeping, Grace. I'll be different. Sleep now." "Good night," he said, his tone laced with something I couldn't decipher. Concern, perhaps? Or something deeper? Ella stared at me with a golden look in her eyes. As I climbed the stairs, I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't untangle. I told myself it was just a moment of vulnerability, a fleeting connection born of loneliness. But deep down, I knew the truth was far more complicated. The following morning, the house was quiet. I lingered in bed longer than usual, trying to make sense of my thoughts. The previous night felt like a dream. Adam's words, his touch. It all seemed so surreal. But when I finally ventured downstairs, the sight of him sitting at the kitchen table, casually scrolling through his phone, reminded me it was all too real. "Morning," he said, glancing up and offering me a warm smile. "Coffee's ready." "Thanks," I murmured, avoiding his gaze as I poured myself a cup. The tension in the room was palpable, though Adam seemed completely at ease, or maybe he was just better at hiding it. As I sipped my coffee, he leaned back in his chair, studying me. "You okay? You seemed off last night." "I'm fine," I said quickly, too quickly. "Just tired, I guess." He didn't press further, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't convinced. I excused myself shortly after, claiming I had errands to run. The truth was, I needed space, time to clear my head and figure out what was happening. But the distance didn't help. As I wandered through the aisles of the grocery store, I found myself replaying our interactions, dissecting every glance, every word. Was I imagining things? Was he? When I returned home later that afternoon, Adam was nowhere to be found. A note on the counter said he'd gone for a run, and I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. I used the time to distract myself with chores, hoping to quiet the thoughts that had taken up permanent residence in my mind. By evening, the house had settled into its usual rhythm. Adam had returned, showered, and retreated to his room, leaving me alone in the living room with a book I wasn't really reading. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made me look up, and there he was, standing in the doorway with that same unreadable expression. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice soft. "Of course not," I replied, though my heart raced at the thought of being alone with him again. He sat down on the couch, not too close but not far enough to ease the tension. For a while we sat in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the ceiling fan. I tried to focus on my book, but his presence was impossible to ignore. "You know," he began, his voice breaking the quiet. "I'd been thinking about what I said last night." I froze, my hands gripping the edges of the book. "What about it?" "I meant it," he said simply. "You deserve to feel special, to be appreciated." "Adam," I started, my voice faltering. "We can't. This is—" "I know," he interrupted gently, his gaze steady. "But I can't pretend I don't see it. You're unhappy. You're lonely. And you deserve so much more than that." His words hit me like a tidal wave, stripping away the walls I'd built to contain my emotions. He was right. I was lonely, unbearably lonely. And in that moment, his words felt like a lifeline. But it wasn't right. I couldn't let myself go down this path, no matter how tempting it was. This can't happen," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "I know," he said again, his voice tinged with sadness. "But that doesn't mean I don't care." He reached out then, his hand resting lightly on mine. I didn't pull away, and for a moment we sat there in silence, the weight of unspoken feelings filling the space between us. Finally, I stood, breaking the spell. "I need to get some rest," I said, my voice barely audible. "Good night," he said softly, his eyes never leaving mine. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I felt a mix of relief and regret. I had stopped it before it went too far, but the tension between us was undeniable, and I knew deep down that this was far from over. The days that followed were a delicate dance. Adam and I avoided being alone together as much as possible, both of us retreating to the safety of routines that felt hollow and forced. Yet, despite our best efforts, the tension lingered like an unspoken secret, always just beneath the surface. One evening, the sky darkened with the promise of a storm. The distant rumble of thunder echoed through the house, and I stood by the window, watching as raindrops began to streak the glass. Mark had called earlier to say his flight was delayed yet again, leaving me to face another lonely night. The thought didn't bother me as much as it used to, perhaps because I wasn't truly alone. As I turned to leave the room, I nearly collided with Adam. He stood in the doorway, his hair damp from a shower, his casual t-shirt and sweatpants giving him an air of effortless ease. "Sorry," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Didn't mean to startle you." "It's fine," I replied, stepping back to create some distance. But as I did, I noticed the flicker of something in his eyes, a mix of hesitation and determination. "The storm's getting worse," he said, nodding toward the window. "Figured I'd check on you." "I'm fine," I said, though my voice wavered slightly. "Just another night." He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to keep pretending, you know." "Pretending what?" I asked, my heart racing as I met his gaze. "That you're okay," he said simply. "That you're not carrying all of this on your own." His words cut through me like a blade, and I felt the familiar sting of tears threatening to spill. "Adam, please, don't." "I'm just saying what I see," he said softly, stepping closer. "You deserve better than this." The weight of his words and his presence was overwhelming, and I found myself sinking onto the couch, unable to hold back the tears any longer. He sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. "You don't have to do this alone," he said gently, his voice steady and reassuring. For a moment, I let myself lean into his words, allowing the comfort they offered to wash over me. But as his hand brushed mine, a spark of awareness jolted me back to reality. I pulled away, shaking my head. "This is wrong," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm your stepmother, Adam. We can't—" "You're more than that," he interrupted, his tone earnest. "You're a person who's been overlooked and taken for granted for far too long." The raw honesty in his voice left me speechless. For so long, I had buried my own needs and desires, convincing myself they didn't matter. But here he was, seeing me in a way no one else had, and it was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I can't do this," I whispered, standing abruptly. "I need to clear my head." I left the room before he could respond, my mind racing as I retreated to the solitude of my bedroom. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within me, the thunder rolling in waves as lightning illuminated the darkened sky. Hours later, long after the storm had passed, I found myself wandering downstairs in search of something to drink. The house was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. But as I entered the kitchen, I stopped in my tracks. Adam was there, sitting at the counter with a glass of water. He looked up as I entered, his expression a mix of surprise and something deeper. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. "Something like that," I replied, avoiding his gaze as I poured myself a glass of wine. We stood there in silence, the tension between us thick and unyielding. Finally, he spoke. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable earlier." I looked at him then, his sincerity disarming. "You didn't. It's just complicated." "I know," he said, his eyes searching mine. "But I meant what I said. You deserve to be happy." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, I felt the pull of something I couldn't name. Before I could stop myself, I reached out, placing a hand on his. "Thank you," I said softly, "for caring." He didn't respond, but the way his hand tightened around mine said more than words ever could. The world seemed to tilt then, the space between us shrinking, until there was no space at all. And then, before I could think, before I could stop it, his lips were on mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if testing the waters. But as the moments stretched, it deepened, the barriers we had both tried so hard to maintain crumbling beneath the weight of our shared longing. His hands framed my face, his touch gentle, yet insistent, and I felt myself melting into him despite every reason not to. Reality crashed over me like a wave, and I pulled back abruptly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "I can't," I whispered, my voice breaking. "This isn't right." "I know," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I'm sorry." We stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence between us louder than any words. Finally, I turned and left, retreating to the safety of my room. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I knew nothing would ever be the same. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. Adam was gone, a note on the counter saying he'd gone to visit a friend for the day. I spent the hours that followed in a daze, my mind replaying the events of the night before on an endless loop. When he returned that evening, we barely spoke, the weight of what had happened hanging over us like a cloud. But despite the awkwardness, I couldn't ignore the way my heart raced whenever he was near, or the way his gaze lingered just a moment too long. Days turned into weeks, and the unspoken tension between us grew. Mark returned from his trip, oblivious to the undercurrents running through our home. I threw myself into the role of the perfect wife, hoping to drown out the memories that haunted me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget the way Adam's lips had felt against mine, the warmth of his touch, the way he had seen me in a way no one else ever had. It was all seared into my mind, impossible to erase. Weeks passed, but the tension remained as sharp as ever, an invisible thread binding Adam and me together in ways I didn't fully understand. Mark was home now, his presence adding a layer of complexity to the situation. But even with him around, I couldn't stop the thoughts that crept into my mind at the most inopportune moments. Adam's touch, his kiss, it lingered, haunting me like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. One evening, Mark suggested a family dinner, a rare opportunity for the three of us to sit down together. I agreed, desperate for a sense of normalcy, though the idea filled me with unease. Adam seemed hesitant, but joined us nonetheless, his usual confidence replaced with a quiet restraint. The meal began uneventfully enough, with Mark recounting stories from his recent trip. I nodded along, my responses automatic, as I tried to avoid meeting Adam's gaze across the table. But as the conversation shifted to Adam's plans for the future, the tension resurfaced. "So, Adam," Mark said, spearing a piece of steak with his fork, "have you thought about what you'll do after graduation?" Adam shrugged, his tone casual. "I've been considering a few options, maybe grad school or traveling for a while." "Wandering," Mark chuckled. "Ah, to be young and have the world at your feet. Enjoy it while it lasts." Adam's eyes flicked to mine then, a fleeting glance that felt loaded with meaning. My heart raced, and I quickly looked away, focusing on my plate, but the moment didn't go unnoticed. "Sorry," my voice hissed. I knelt before him, and his eyes slid past me. "You've been quiet tonight," Mark said, turning his attention to me. "Everything okay?" "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." Mark seemed satisfied with my response, but Adam's gaze lingered, the unspoken tension between us thick enough to choke on. I excused myself as soon as the meal was over, retreating to the kitchen to escape the suffocating atmosphere. I was washing dishes when I felt Adam's presence behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know it was him. The faint scent of his cologne and the heat of his proximity were unmistakable. "You shouldn't be in here," I said quietly, my hands trembling as I scrubbed at a plate. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay," he replied, his voice soft but insistent. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice betrayed me. "You should go. Your dad will wonder where you are." Adam stepped closer, his hand brushing mine as I placed the plate on the rack. The touch was brief, but enough to send a shiver down my spine. "We need to talk," he said, his tone serious. "There's nothing to talk about," I whispered, my resolve weakening with every second he was near. "You don't believe that," he said, his voice barely audible. "I know you feel it too." His words hung in the air, and for a moment I considered turning to face him, to confront the emotions swirling within me. But before I could, Mark called out from the living room, his voice breaking the spell. "Adam, come here for a second." Adam hesitated, his hand lingering on the counter. "We're not done," he said, his voice low. Then he turned and left, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as memories of the past few weeks played in my mind like a broken record. Every glance, every touch, every word felt magnified, the weight of it all pressing down on me like a vice. By morning, I had made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, caught between what I knew was right and what my heart refused to let go of. I needed to put an end to it, once and for all. I waited until Mark left for work, the sound of his car fading into the distance. Then I went to find Adam. He was in the backyard, shirtless and mowing the lawn, his toned physique glistening in the sunlight. The sight made my stomach twist with a mix of guilt and longing, but I pushed the feelings aside. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firm. Adam turned off the mower, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "I figured you'd say that." I motioned for him to follow me inside, and we settled in the living room, the silence between us heavy and charged. "This has to stop," I began, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "Whatever this is, it can't continue." Adam leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he met my gaze. "I don't want to hurt you," he said softly, "but I can't pretend I don't feel the way I do." "And what way is that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I care about you," he said simply, "more than I should, more than I've ever cared about anyone." His confession hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me breathless. "Adam, this is wrong," I said, shaking my head. "We're family. People would never understand." "Do you care what people think?" he interrupted, his tone earnest. "Or are you just scared of what this means for us?" "I'm scared of losing everything," I admitted, my voice breaking. "My marriage, my reputation, everything I've built." He reached out then, his hand covering mine in a gesture that felt both comforting and dangerous. "You don't have to lose anything," he said. "We can figure this out, together." For a moment, I let myself believe him, the sincerity in his voice a balm to my frayed nerves. But reality came crashing back, and I pulled my hand away. "I can't," I said firmly. "We can't?" Adam's expression shifted, a mix of hurt and resignation crossing his features. "I understand," he said finally, his voice quiet. "But I hope you know that I never meant to make things harder for you." With that, he stood and left the room, leaving me alone with the weight of my decision. I knew it was the right thing to do, but as I sat there in the deafening silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just lost something I would never find again. Before I could say a word, the following days passed in a haze of awkward silences and strained interactions. Adam kept his distance, and I didn't blame him. It was for the best. But the weight of my decision felt heavier with each passing moment. Mark, oblivious to the turmoil brewing beneath the surface, carried on as though everything was normal. To him, it probably was. But nothing was normal anymore. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I found myself in the living room staring at the framed family photo on the mantel. It was taken 2 years ago during a family trip to the coast. In the picture, we looked happy, blissfully unaware of how fragile that happiness truly was. "You okay?" Mark's voice startled me, pulling me from my thoughts. "Yes," I replied quickly, turning to face him. "Just thinking." He walked over, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. You've seemed distant lately. Is everything all right? I hesitated, the guilt gnawing at me. Just tired, I said, offering a weak smile. It's been a lot lately. Mark nodded, his concern evident, but not pressing further. Well, if you need a break, maybe we could go away for a weekend, just the two of us. This sounds nice, I said, though the words felt hollow. A weekend away wouldn't fix what was broken, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him that. Later that night, as I lay in bed beside Mark, I heard faint footsteps in the hallway. My heart clenched, knowing it was Adam. For weeks, we had avoided being alone together, but something told me this time was different. I slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake Mark, and made my way to the kitchen, where I found Adam sitting at the counter, nursing a glass of water. He looked up as I entered, his expression a mix of surprise and something deeper. Resignation, perhaps, or regret. I didn't mean to wake you, he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that matched my own. You didn't? I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I sat across from him, the silence between us thick and suffocating. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, he began, his eyes fixed on the glass in his hands, about how this can't happen. And, I prompted, bracing myself for whatever he was about to say. You're right, he said finally, his voice heavy with emotion. It can't. I don't want to make things harder for you, or for us, so I've decided to leave early. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. You don't have to do that, I said quickly, the thought of him leaving filling me with a mix of relief and dread. I do, he said firmly, his gaze meeting mine. This isn't fair to you. Or to him. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I looked away, unable to face the raw honesty in his expression. I never wanted to hurt you, I whispered. I know, he said softly, and you haven't. Not really. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of our unspoken emotions filling the space between us. Finally, Adam stood, his movements deliberate and slow. I'm leaving tomorrow, he said, his voice steady. I just wanted you to know. Adam, I said, my voice trembling. I'm sorry. Don't be, he said, offering a small, sad smile. I'll be fine, so will you. And with that, he turned and left, leaving me alone in the dimly lit kitchen. I sat there for hours, the reality of his departure sinking in. It was for the best, I knew that. But the thought of never seeing him again, of losing the connection we had shared, filled me with an ache I couldn't ignore. The next morning, Adam was gone. He left a note on the counter thanking us for the summer and wishing us well. Mark didn't question his early departure, chalking it up to a busy college schedule, but for me, the absence was palpable. An empty space in the fabric of my life that I couldn't quite mend. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into repairing my marriage, determined to make things work. I planned date nights, engaged in conversations I had long neglected, and tried to rekindle the spark that had once burned brightly between Mark and me. But no matter how hard I tried, there was a part of me that remained distant, locked away with memories I could never share. Life went on, as it always does. Mark and I found a semblance of normalcy, and I convinced myself that it was enough. But on quiet nights, when the house was still and my thoughts wandered, I would think of Adam, of his smile, his touch, the way he had seen me in a way no one else ever had. It was a chapter I couldn't revisit, a secret I would carry with me for the rest of my life. And though it was painful, it was also beautiful. A reminder of the complexities of love, the fragility of human connection, and the choices that define who we are. Closing thoughts. This story delves into the emotional consequences of forbidden desire and the resilience required to move forward. It reflects the complexities of human relationships and the moral struggles that arise in moments of vulnerability. Life settled into a fragile rhythm. Adam was gone, Mark was none the wiser, and I had convinced myself that time would dull the ache. But some wounds never truly heal. They only lie dormant, waiting for the right moment to resurface. It happened one rainy evening, months after Adam's departure. I was tidying up the living room when the doorbell rang. Mark wasn't home yet, so I assumed it was a delivery, but when I opened the door, my heart stopped. Adam stood there, soaked from the rain, his suitcase at his feet and an expression on his face that I couldn't quite read. "Hi," he said simply, his voice laced with hesitation. "Adam," I stammered, my thoughts racing. "What are you doing here?" "I had nowhere else to go," he admitted, running a hand through his wet hair. "Can I come in?" I hesitated for only a moment before stepping aside, allowing him into the warmth of the house. He set his suitcase down and looked around, his eyes landing on the framed photo still perched on the mantel. "Everything looks the same," he murmured, almost to himself. "Why are you here, Adam?" I asked, my voice firmer now. "I thought we agreed—" "No," he interrupted, his gaze snapping to mine. But I didn't know where else to turn." Oh. His words softened my resolve, and I motioned for him to sit. He explained that he had dropped out of school after a series of bad decisions, failed classes, mounting debt, and the fallout from a breakup with someone I hadn't known existed. "I'm not proud of it," he admitted, his shoulders slumping. But I couldn't stay there anymore. As he spoke, I felt a pang of guilt. Had I been part of the reason he spiraled? Had our tension, our shared secret, driven him to this point? "You could have called," I said quietly. "I didn't think you'd want to hear from me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "After everything." His vulnerability stirred something in me, a mix of compassion and regret. "You're always welcome here," I said finally. "But Mark—" "He doesn't know," Adam finished, his tone flat. "I get it." The tension was suffocating, but I tried to push it aside. I offered him a guest room, a warm meal, and a chance to collect himself. But as the evening wore on, the unspoken history between us loomed larger with every passing moment. The next day, Mark came home early, surprised but pleased to see Adam. "It's good to have you back, son," he said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Stay as long as you need." Watching them together was almost unbearable. The warmth in Mark's voice, the pride in his eyes. It was a stark contrast to the turmoil swirling within me. Adam played the part of the grateful stepson perfectly, but I saw the cracks beneath the surface. That night, as Mark slept soundly upstairs, I found Adam in the kitchen, nursing a glass of whiskey. His eyes met mine as I entered, and the tension between us was immediate and electric. "This was a mistake," I said, my voice shaking. "Was it?" he asked, his tone laced with something I couldn't quite place. "Because it feels like the first real thing I've done in months." His words sent a chill through me, and I shook my head, backing away. You need to move on, Adam. We both do. He stood, his movements deliberate as he closed the distance between us. I tried, he said, his voice low. But I can't stop thinking about you. Stop, I whispered, my heart pounding. This isn't... The sound of Mark's voice calling my name from upstairs shattered the moment. Adam stepped back, his expression unreadable, and I hurried upstairs, leaving him alone in the dimly lit kitchen. Days turned into weeks, and Adam remained under our roof, the tension between us building with every stolen glance and unspoken word. But it wasn't until a fateful evening that the truth came to light. We were sitting down to dinner when Mark leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful look on his face. You know, he said casually, Adam mentioned something interesting the other day. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. What's that? He said you two have been getting along better lately, Mark continued, his tone light but curious. Even said he felt like you'd grown closer. Adam's expression was carefully neutral, but I could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. We've had time to talk, he said simply. Mark smiled, oblivious to the undercurrents running through the room. I'm glad to hear it. Family's important. The conversation moved on, but my mind remained stuck on Mark's words. That night, as I lay awake in bed, the weight of our shared secret threatened to crush me. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. Not with Mark's trust and Adam's presence unraveling the fragile balance I had tried so hard to maintain. A twist came 2 days later. I was cleaning the living room when Mark entered, his face unusually serious. We need to talk, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. What's wrong? I asked, my pulse quickening. It's Adam, he said, his voice heavy. He told me everything. The room spun, my mind racing as I tried to process his words. What do you mean? About his struggles, Mark clarified, his expression pained. The pressure he's been under, the mistakes he's made. He feels like he's let us down. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. He's going to move out, Mark continued. He thinks it's the best thing for everyone. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Maybe he's right. Mark placed a hand on my shoulder, his eyes filled with concern. I hope he knows how much we care about him, and how much we're here for him. As he left the room, I sank onto the couch, my emotions a tangled mess. Adam's departure felt inevitable, but the thought of him leaving again, this time for good, was almost too much to bear. The night before he left, Adam found me in the backyard, staring up at the stars. I'm leaving in the morning, he said quietly. I know, I replied, my voice barely audible. He hesitated, then added, I'm sorry for everything. Don't be, I said, turning to face him. Just take care of yourself. He nodded, his expression somber. You too. As he walked away, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The storm had passed, but its aftermath would linger, shaping the person I had become and the choices I would make moving forward. As Adam's car disappeared down the driveway, a strange stillness settled over the house. I stood at the window, watching until the taillights were swallowed by the distance, my emotions a tangled knot of relief, sorrow, and guilt. He was gone. This time, for good. Mark joined me moments later, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. He'll be okay, he said, his voice steady. We raised him right. I nodded, forcing a smile, but the truth hung heavy in my chest. I had let something dangerous, something forbidden, bloom in the shadows of my loneliness. And though Adam was no longer here, the consequences of our connection lingered, shaping the quiet spaces of my mind. That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling, replaying the events that had unraveled our lives, the tension, the temptation, the choices made in weakness. They were a part of me now, a shadow I couldn't outrun. Adam's absence left an emptiness I couldn't ignore, but it also brought clarity. I had been seen, understood, and cherished, even if only for a fleeting moment. And while the weight of that truth would remain, so too would the lessons it taught me about myself and what I truly needed to heal.